Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, to the Miller Center. I'm Barbara Perry. I'm the director of the Presidential Studies program here at the Miller Center. And this lecture constitutes the first in this fall's continuation of the 2017 Historical Presidency lecture series. So I see a number of familiar faces. I know a number of you came to 1, 2, or 3 of our kickoff last spring for this topic. This is a calendar year project, so we have 2 more after Melody Barnes today, and that's on October 10th. Be sure to mark your calendars. President Ken Gormley, the president of Duquesne University and recently was also there as the dean of the law school, will be speaking on this broad topic of presidents and the Constitution. And in fact, he was the inspiration, and his book was the inspiration for this project of looking at presidents through the Constitution, or using the Constitution to look at presidents. I know you all read this over the summer because I had recommended it to you last spring, so there will be a short test at the end of today. And then November 13th, Sid Milkis, our colleague here, the Presidential Scholar Supreme, will be our anchor person for this project and this series. Today, thanks to my colleague Stephanie George-Gakis Abbott, who is the Assistant Director of Presidential Studies here at the Miller Center, we are pleased to present my colleague and friend now, Melody Barnes. And she is a colleague because she is a senior fellow currently at the Miller Center. We are very proud of that fact. And she also teaches a course now at the Virginia Law School here at UVA on presidents and public policy. She also is a frequent media commentator. In fact, I was in Louisville during the terrible events of this past August, and I'd gone to church and I was having brunch with an old college friend, and she looked over my shoulder at a TV in this restaurant where we were having brunch, and she said, "Oh, there's a professor from the University of Virginia." And I turned around and I said, "That's Melody Barnes. That's my friend Melody Barnes." So Melody was commenting on the events that had taken place, sadly, here in Charlottesville that weekend. Melody is a native Virginian, and therefore we do give her special dispensation for having attended Chapel Hill as an undergraduate. And she is so loyal to UNC that she takes Bill up on his offers, as she did last winter. She and her husband went to the UVA-UNC basketball game. So she's made of sterner stuff than I am. I can no longer take Bill up on his request and invitation for me to go to see my alma mater play, the University of Virginia, in basketball, because we are demolished, and that is the University of Louisville Cardinals are demolished every time they play the University of Virginia, whether it's here or in Louisville. Melody then went on to the University of Michigan Law School, and from there she joined a law firm in New York City. She also had a position at the Equal Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, in Washington. For purposes of the Miller Center and its projects, particularly in oral history, we like to note that she served as the chief counsel to Senator Edward Kennedy on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and because she had that role, she was a mainstay and a very important participant in the Edward Kennedy Oral History Project that the Miller Center performed. She also has served at the think tank, the Center for American Progress. She joined Senator Barack Obama's presidential campaign for 2008 in the policy realm, and then she also, once he was elected, helped to lead his transition team to the White House. She then served as an assistant to the president and was the director of his Domestic Policy Council. And from that position, she then went on to the Aspen Institute and New York University Law School. Her title today of her lecture, I think, is particularly intriguing: A Republic If You Can Keep It, the role of the president in upholding the idea of America. So with that, if you will join me in a warm welcome for Melody Barnes.
There is a famous picture, and it is literally one of my favorites, of President Barack Obama, and he's smiling and leaning over, bent at the waist, so that a young African-American boy can touch his hair. And you can see this child literally wanting to understand, is this man, is this president like me? This is one of my favorite photos, not just because it reflects and captures an extraordinary moment for this little boy and this man, but because of what it conveys. In this very simple human gesture about the arc of the idea and the ideals that are America. It was about 150 years after the Emancipation Proclamation that I stood in the Oval Office with two other little African-American boys. One of them was my 12-year-old godson, Robbie. He's now 19 and at Brown University, so he's Rob. And his 8-year-old brother, Ryan. And along with their mother, I had the opportunity to introduce them to President Obama. And Ryan, who we call the mayor at this point, he knows no strangers. And when Ryan turned the corner in the outer Oval and saw President Obama leaning against the door of the Oval Office, he literally stopped and his eyes got wide and he looked at the president and he said, "Oh my God." We went into the Oval, and Robbie, who is the quiet, studious one, he's now a sophomore at Brown University, he stood in the Oval Office and he was quiet, and his eyes were trained on something across the room. And President Obama noticed that, and he noticed what he was looking at, which was a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation. And he began to quiz Robbie on that, and they had a discussion. And I have to say, for me, it was a poetic moment in the Oval Office with this president, my godson, having a conversation about the Emancipation Proclamation with this president. It seemed at that moment that a critical element of the American idea had been fulfilled. America is a radical idea, founded on the belief that a notion and a nation of citizens secure in their individual rights can give their consent to be governed by representatives of their choosing, and in so doing, embark upon a collective project of forming a more perfect nation. The question before us today, as Barbara mentioned, is the title of my talk. What role does the American president have in upholding those ideas and ideals? The American president can shape our founding American principles in many ways. Think about public policy. Just through executive actions alone, there was the integration of the armed services, help in desegregating public schools. There was our work to ensure that Americans would become more free through the Emancipation Proclamation itself. And in fact, through an executive order to ensure that young children who were brought here as very young children would have some relief from deportation. And then there's the flip side, an executive order that would ensure the removal and internment of Japanese Americans. But in addition to policy, the president also stands as a powerful symbol of those principles and those ideas. My godson, his little brother, that little boy touching President Obama's hair, and those who now say they want to see America made great again, see the Obama and the Trump presidencies in very, very different ways. But in both instances, those presidents are powerful symbols of hope and change, of the American idea itself, of our republic. Before I go more deeply, I want to stop at this point, and I want to thank Bill, who is my friend and a wonderful, wonderful leader of the Miller Center, and Barbara, who has become a friend as we worked on the Kennedy Oral History Project together and as we've started to do our work here at the Miller Center together, for inviting me to be here as part of this series. I know that I stand here as a lawyer and not a scholar among great scholars who will be speaking to you over the course of the next several months, and it is indeed a privilege to be here with you this afternoon and to explore this topic. So let's continue. As the Constitutional Convention completed its work, Benjamin Franklin is said to have had the conversation that is part of my title. He was encountered by a curious woman as he walked out of the building in Constitution Hall in Philadelphia, and she encountered him and said to him, "So what have you given us, a monarchy or a republic?" His response, "A republic, if you can keep it." It's not clear, as I said, if that encounter ever took place. I've done some historical research, and maybe there are real historians in the room who can answer that question. But it's an often told story, I think, for an important reason. Our successful pursuit of Republican self-government wasn't guaranteed in 1789, and it is not guaranteed today. I say that again. It is not guaranteed today. The opportunity expressed in our founding remains in our hands. In the 228 years since its ratification, we have both advanced and undermined the founding American idea, and the men who have led us, even the best among them, embody that friction. As we approach the question of the role of the American president in upholding these ideals and principles, let's consider the efforts to sustain our republic through the lens of one of America's greatest contradictions, that of racial equity. First, I want to examine, as I've set out, the ideas and ideals that are the foundation of our country and how they're bound up in this sense of civic mythology. And then I want to consider Presidents Washington and Lincoln and Johnson as they illuminate the progress and struggles in our march forward, realizing the promise of our founding. And finally, what does the Trump presidency reveal about the state of our founding principles today, and what might we all consider as we go forward? In doing that, I want to take you back a little further than that conversation or that encounter with Benjamin Franklin to May 1787, when the outcome of the founders' first attempt to govern our young country was, very simply, a disaster. The Articles of Confederation had created a, quote, firm league of friendship. Now, think about America today and governing that as a firm league of friendship among the new states, and they weren't worth the paper they were written on. While the Articles reflected the founders' fear of monarchy, tyranny, and despotism, it soon became clear that they were ill-suited for the act of governing. And if the country was to move forward, it would have to find a new way. So the Articles of Confederation were tossed out, and by 1789, apropos of Benjamin Franklin's comment, a new constitution had been ratified. But it wasn't easy to get there, and we often gloss over that task. It's almost cartoonish. You know, there was a constitutional convention, they all came together, you see the famous photograph, and they're all standing there like this, and all of a sudden we had a constitution. But that isn't the way that it worked. Many strongly believed that ceding so much power to a federal government, a central government, threatened individual freedom and liberty, while some, including George Washington, were still flirting with the idea of a monarchy. Perhaps not then, but maybe just later. After all, do we really trust the people? Rhode Island didn't even show up. Connecticut dragged its feet. Delaware was fighting proportional representation. And of course, we know that the framers struck the notorious 3/5 compromise, where slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person. But our governing mulligan, the second attempt to constitute the new nation, was launched based on a radical, revolutionary set of ideas, rooted in small r Republican government. The framers of the Constitution were conscientious students of history and philosophy. Indeed, they were the best of the American Enlightenment. Their deliberations were informed by the ancients, Locke's theory of consent of the governed, Montesquieu's thinking about separation of powers, and the natural rights philosophers of the Scottish Enlightenment. The founders believed that the civic ideals and virtues were foundationing to our new republic. In their view, successful Republican self-government demanded that citizens demonstrate the type of civic virtue that was to some degree at least characterized, if not by selflessness, at least by a restraint on self-interest. But political scientist Roger Smith interrogates those founding ideals in his work, Civic Ideals, and cautions us to recognize that our lofty American idea isn't always aligned with reality. Our true political paradigm is bound up in a set of civic myths that we've embraced since our founding and which have become more challenging to perpetuate over time. In 1997, and when you hear these words, think about it, this was 1997, he writes the following. Today, Martin Luther King's dream of an integrated nation seems not only remote, but undesirable to many Black and white Americans. Proposals for immigration restriction abound, and controversies rage over the lines that should be drawn between aliens and citizens. American cities crackle with explosive tensions among Latinos and Korean Americans, West Indians, Asian Indians, Jews, and many other groups, not just Blacks and whites. And disputes over multiculturalism, hate speech, and so-called feminazis reverberate through the land. And what contributed to the friction in American life? Through most of U.S. history, he writes, lawmakers pervasively and unapologetically structured U.S. citizenship in terms of illiberal and undemocratic racial, ethnic, and gender hierarchies for reasons rooted in basic, enduring imperatives of political life. In other words, we've embraced the civic myth that we are entitled to pursue a natural human right to liberty, when in reality, political pressures and self-interest have always yielded that right to the privileged elite. Smith asserts that sometimes civic myths function as noble lies that enable people to live together, to surround themselves around a set of principles and shared values and customs. But sometimes they function as ignoble lies that foster inequality, promote exclusivity, and provide a mechanism for leaders to exploit their citizens. Our founding ideas and civic myths have a foot in both camps, serving the noble intention of building a country that rejects tyranny, creating the architecture and the institutions that allow us to engage in representative government, and the protection of individual rights, but simultaneously promulgating ignoble, racist, sexist, and elitist traditions that protected position and property. And the friction between myth and reality has only gotten worse since 1789. When you think about it, citizens at that time had a lot in common: gender, race, European heritage, because some of those characteristics were requirements for the rights and responsibilities that came with citizenship. Those common characteristics attenuated over time as the country has become more expansive in its idea of what constitutes a citizen, including women, including people of color, and liberalizing our immigration policies. And that attenuation has created new pressures that exacerbated America's challenge in aligning her foundational ideas and principles with her reality. Even our most celebrated presidents, even the best among us, embody that friction between our ideas and our reality. So what better place to start than with the first, George Washington. Washington was certainly revered as a citizen. He had a persona, in fact, that encouraged his peers, convinced them that the prospect of a presidency could be a reality that they could live with. He was dragged out of retirement, back from Mount Vernon. You think about it, he's fought the war, he's gone home, he loves his home. I mean, who doesn't love Virginia? And he wants to stay there. But Madison and Randolph convince him that he has got to show up in Philadelphia. He was a quiet but commanding force, a comforting presence, the obvious first president to his peers. And it was in that first presidency that we see evidence of the challenges that he and others would face as they had to stay true, or tried to stay true, to this American idea. Let's not forget that the men who led the nation were struggling to hold it together. I mean, think about your worst day and think about that exponentially. The country was deeply in debt. We were testing new institutions. It had little standing among the superpowers of the world, and at almost every turn, they were debating and arguing the issue of slavery. As those issues raged around him, Washington spent much of his presidency navigating uncharted waters while trying to keep America intact, ultimately warning the country against political and geographic faction taking precedent over national unity. He implored the country to recognize that it would have greater strength, greater resource, proportionably greater security from external danger as a unified whole. He stressed that the national unity was the basis for happiness, proclaiming in his farewell address, quote, "The name of American, which belongs to you in your national capacity, must always exalt the just pride of patriotism more than any appellation derived from local distinctions." And he went on to say, in this sense, it is that your union ought to be considered as a main prop of your liberty, and that love of one ought to endear you to preservation of the other. It was through that lens that Washington also addressed the issue of slavery. Citizen Washington was, like Virginians Jefferson and Madison, a slaveholder. Over the course of his life, it's documented that his opinion about the enslavement of humans evolved from acceptance to colonization to the manumission of his Mount Vernon slaves. In 1786, he said, "I never mean to possess another slave by purchase. It is among my first wishes to see some plan adopted by the legislature by which slavery in the country may be abolished by slow, sure, imperceptible degrees." Now, far from the full-throated rejection of slavery that's articulated today, expected today, or by abolitionists of the time, it was, in fact, an evolution when considered in 19th century terms. But leading up to and throughout the drafting of the Constitution, Washington remained silent about these issues because he didn't believe that there was the consensus among states to deal with the freeing of slaves. He concluded that a constitutional compromise, as we know, would create a pathway to eventually outlaw slavery. And that was the best the country could do without risking the success of the new American project. And as Washington's first Secretary of State and our third president, the person to whom we owe so much here, would later say, "But it is if we have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is on one scale and self-preservation in the other." Country came first, even if the very ideas upon which the country was founded had to be sacrificed. A sacrifice perhaps more easily made because of the views and perceptions of race that were imported to the country as early as 1492, and certainly when the first Americans and the first slaves set foot on soil in 1619. Washington successfully struggled to nurture a fragile new nation into existence, the task of mammoth proportions, almost over unimaginable odds, and because of his work, we reap those rewards today. He was a critical midwife to the American idea that is, as Roger Smith said to us, both a noble and a noble lie. Washington and his successors believed that enslaved people would be granted freedom later by a later generation who would be more virtuous and wise. And in fact, in 1824, Jefferson wrote to Lydia Howard Sigourney, who was an advocate for women and for Native Americans, Slavery is a blot on our moral history. I shall not live to see it, but those who come after us will be wiser than we are. For light is spreading and man improving. To that advancement I look, and to the dispensation of an all-wise and all-powerful providence to devise the meaning of effecting what is right. Until then, slavery would be a negotiable to maintain the hard-won new country, even as it knowingly violated the American idea, the natural rights principles that undergirded the Constitution. So George Washington's challenge, the precariousness of the nation's well-being, complicated political negotiations, and his countrymen's differing and deeply held and conflicting views about race would be a leitmotif through the American presidency. And we certainly felt that when we walked in the door in January of 2009. If you remember, you think back to that time, we sat on the cliff of economic disaster. Frozen credit markets, we were losing over 800,000 jobs every single day. And that is, to this day, a data point I constantly have to look up because it's hard to imagine 800,000 jobs, every month. And at the same time, people were seeing their savings and their assets wiped out. And Congress and pundits and the president debated and negotiated the next steps we would take. But it shouldn't be surprising to know that issues of race were entering that debate as well. People of color, like all low-income people, were hit the hardest by that economic crisis. But the economic devastation was layered over by generations of discriminatory public policy. And as a result, many African Americans, including legislators, were frustrated with us, with our administration, with the president, because they felt that President Obama's policy efforts didn't go far enough. While others, in spite of the largest tax cut in history, suspected that the policy unnecessarily favored low-income Americans, particularly African Americans and Latinos. It was a theme that would follow us throughout the presidency. How would the first African American president hold the nation together at a time of crisis and also promote foundational American principles while he was so obviously seen as one who who was a symbol for the African American community, for people of color, and others who were hoping for progress on issues of race and ethnicity. And so now I turn to Abraham Lincoln. So if George Washington was responsible for knitting the nation together, if he was so instrumental in that, Abraham Lincoln was the one who held it together. Fighting the forces of the ultimate faction, to use Washington's word and to go back to Washington's concern, the Civil War was catalyzed, as we know, by the country's division over slavery. And Lincoln and America struggled with America's foundational ideas as they dealt with this critical issue. Lincoln, the author of the Emancipation Proclamation, condemned slavery while he was also holding a range of opinions about the issue of race. He recounts his parents' intentional move to the free state of Indiana, as well as his empathy as he was watching slaves be moved further south. He described slavery as a monstrous injustice, and in an 1857 speech given in Springfield, Illinois, he criticized the Dred Scott decision, arguing that the Declaration of Independence's principles were central and aspirational. However, historian Jean Baker goes on to quote Lincoln in June of 1857. She wrote, "I think," he said, "the authors of that notable instrument, the Declaration of Independence," and this is Lincoln, "intended to include all men, but they did not intend to declare all men equal in all respects. They did not mean to say all were equal in color, size, intellect, moral developments, or social capacity. They defined the tolerance distinctness in what respect they did consider all men created equal, equal in certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Lincoln thought African American men had to work, should work, and should be allowed to benefit from their labor. And President Lincoln was known as kind and hospitable to the African Americans with whom he came in contact. But into and throughout his presidency, he held varying opinions about what would happen whenever slavery ended. Like Jefferson and Madison, Andrew Jackson, and abolitionist Harriet Beecher Stowe, for some time Lincoln supported colonization. While he often spoke of voluntary colonization, there were times, historian Eric Foner notes, that he also used the word deportation. Lincoln argued that colonization was the best chance African Americans would have for a better life. He told a group of Black leaders in 1862, "Your race is suffering, in my judgment, the greatest wrong inflicted on any people," as he also tiptoed around the issues of racism, which he did not denounce, saying, "Whether it is, quote, right or wrong, I need not discuss." Lincoln seemed to hold on to his views about colonization even as he emancipated enslaved people living in the District of Columbia and as he planned for the Emancipation Proclamation. But the Emancipation Proclamation was, in fact, a turning point for Lincoln, even as it was also used as a tool to increase white loyalty to the Union. By the time he signed the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, the document that freed slaves in states where the federal government had no control, leaving slavery in place in the border states and in the Confederate states under Union control, Lincoln had shed or was shedding many of his past views about the inferiority of African Americans and their limited role in American political life. He had moved closer to other Republicans. According to Eric Foner, as 1863 approached, Lincoln rejected the idea of compensation for slaveholders. He rejected colonization, which had been in the fall version just a few months earlier of the Emancipation Proclamation, and he authorized the enrollment of Black military soldiers, not military laborers as originally considered. And by 1864, he believed the vote for, quote, very intelligent men like Frederick Douglass was something that was possible, and later for those African American men who fought in the war. However, historian James McPherson points out that Lincoln's chief concern, the matter about which he had always been inflexible, was, like Washington, preservation of the Union. Before the war began, he would do anything to have avoided secession. And during the early days of the war, he was flexible on the issue of emancipation to bring the nation back together. It was only when his chief objective, maintenance of the Union, aligned with emancipation that both were achieved. Until late in the game, for Lincoln, the preservation of the country could be separated from the founding principles that we talked about. Again, however, America survived. The country progressed, and the wheels were set in motion to free millions of enslaved people. And as for President Lincoln, who, as we know, gave his life for the Union, he too evolved. Again, Eric Foner writes, "The story of Lincoln's long embrace of colonization and eventual abandonment of the idea illustrates how he is both a product of his time and he also transcended it. But as Roger Smith categorized them, once again, the noble and ignoble lies persisted in the subsequent Reconstruction and Jim Crow era." And that, of course, brings us to President Johnson. 100 years after Abraham Lincoln's assassination, Lyndon Johnson would attempt to uphold the ideas upon which America had been founded and align them with her laws. Johnson was, however, an improbable steward of those basic principles when it came to the issue of race, because he had spent 2 decades in Congress fighting every piece of civil rights legislation. He opposed legislation crafted to end the poll tax. He opposed segregation in the armed services, and he even opposed legislation to eliminate lynching, because in Johnson's words, the federal government had no more business enacting a law against one form of murder than against another. The Southern Bloc relied on him. He was known for commonly using the N-word to refer to African Americans, and his Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer, Robert Caro, notes that he referred to civil rights legislation as the nigger bill in conversations with Mississippi Democrat and known white supremacist James Eastland. On a very personal level, and for no clear goal, Caro recounts that Johnson brought into the stereotype that African Americans, that all blacks were afraid of snakes. He would drive to gas stations with a snake in his trunk and try to trick black attendants into opening the trunk. On one occasion, he was almost beaten to death with a tire iron by an attendant. For reasons that I've touched on this afternoon, race was a muscular tool in political life and in the life of the country. And Johnson, in his political ascent, used it to build relationships with powerful Southern members of Congress who became his mentors, like Senator Richard Russell of Georgia and Speaker of the House Sam Rayburn of Texas, until 1957. And Caro writes, in 1957, he changes and pushes through the first civil rights bill since Reconstruction. He always had this true, deep compassion for poor people, and particularly poor people of color. But even stronger than that compassion was his ambition. But when the two aligned, when compassion and ambition finally are pointed in the same direction, then Lyndon Johnson becomes a force for racial justice, unequaled certainly since Lincoln. If true, perhaps Johnson believed his quest for power could breathe life into America's foundational principles. He could address some of the ills he experienced growing up very poor in rural Texas, and those he observed when he worked teaching poor Mexican American and African American children. And certainly the times required more. As vice president, he was witness to Martin Luther King Jr. and other leaders demanding civil rights and liberties. And as president, as we all know, one of his first acts was to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and later the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But that wasn't it. He would go on to pass laws on fair housing and Medicaid and food stamps and Indian vocational training, urban mass transit, higher education, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, child nutrition, veterans, the minimum wage, and immigration, all supporting the poor and working class, and all increasing opportunities for people of color. Now, Johnson did his work understanding the thinking and the pathology of racism, while also interpreting a shift in the national mood. Gallup polling taking place between 1963, before President Kennedy was assassinated, and 1964, when LBJ was in the White House and the Civil Rights Act was moving in Congress, showed increasing favorability for civil rights among the general public. Support for racial equity in public spaces increased from 49% to 61% over that time. In the South, however, only 20% of whites supported new civil rights legislation in January 1964, compared to 71% of whites in the rest of the country. That dynamic was reflected in Democratic opposition to the legislation in Congress. Roughly 80% of the House and Senate Republicans voted in favor of the legislation, and roughly 70% of Senate Democrats. Only 10% of lawmakers who represented the states that were in the original Confederacy during the Civil War supported the Civil Rights Act. While it is, again, unclear, one of those pieces of urban myth, we don't know, whether Johnson actually said that the new laws would cost Democrats the South for a generation, it was a logical and indeed accurate assessment. From 1968 forward, white Southern Democrats left the party in droves, and in 1961, while Democrats controlled Southern seats, controlled almost every Southern seat and the vast majority of Southern seats in the House, today the Senate has few Democratic senators from the South, and Republicans control the vast majority of Southern seats in the House. While it is difficult to align the snake-wielding Johnson with civil rights champion Johnson, that moment is evidence of a president willing to sacrifice his faction, his party, to advance the nation's growing sentiment for some measure of unification, or at least desegregation, that a period of struggle and dissension was worth it to ultimately move the country toward its founding principles. There is a wonderful quote from a civil rights worker. She said, "Things ain't what they ought to be, but things sure ain't what they used to be." And as an African American, a Virginian, a Richmonder, things I am very proud of, someone born in the South in the mid-1960s, the former domestic policy advisor to the first African American president, I know, I have lived that progress. America has moved closer to its founding principles, and I acknowledge and am deeply grateful for that national march forward. But we have far to go. That fact is perhaps more evident today than it has been in recent decades. What we're witnessing today did not emerge fully formed in recent months or the past year, or in mid-August here in Charlottesville. It stands on the shoulders of the past, and we had every indication that it was bubbling beneath the surface. Our long history gave rise to the Southern strategy and the symbol of the lazy, black, unscrupulous welfare queen. It permitted the routing of federal highways through working class, often minority communities, as well as federal redlining that slowed or prevented savings acquisition in those communities. When grading neighborhoods largely on the basis of race, the federal government, through the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation, often made comments like, quote, infiltration of Negroes, and, quote, respectable area, but homes are too near Negro area. A single black household in a middle-class community could make an entire neighborhood, quote, risky for lending per the federal government. Those are just a few examples of the use of race or racially coded language in the rhetoric and policies of presidential candidates and presidents and their administrations. Language and policies antithetical to the expansion of individual liberties and rights, and they serve to divide. Unfortunately, as with times past, today's messengers carry similar messages and have found an audience in many instances agitated by current economic and social trends. Throughout American history, confidence in the American idea has ebbed and flowed. Although it has been seen short-term declines during times of acute national stress, over the last 2 centuries, America's confidence trend line has generally been positive. Even as troubling economic and social trends began to spread and take hold in the latter part of the 20th century, rhetoric proclaiming that America's best days were ahead of us still found a largely receptive audience across the nation and among a majority of Americans. And that is no longer. Today's collapse in confidence should surprise no one. Access to the American dream, which has confounded the majority of people of color for centuries and led to high levels of family disintegration and crime and substance abuse and hopelessness, is now a problem that knows few boundaries. No matter the cause, whether it's globalization or the rise of technology or substandard education that's inadequately prepared people for today's economy, Americans are hurting regardless of race and ethnicity. In her book, Strangers in Their Own Land, award-winning sociologist Arlie Russell Hochschild reveals her research after spending 5 years talking to members of the Tea Party in Lake Charles, Louisiana. After years of intimate conversations, she describes, quote, hopes, fears, pride, shame, resentment, and anxiety in the lives of those that she had befriended. Their deep story, and that's the language she uses, their deep story, as she calls it, reflects all of that. And when she shared what she had heard, her articulation back to those she had spent those 5 years with, they agreed with her. And she wrote, "People want to achieve the American dream, but for a mixture of reasons they are being held back. And this leads people to feel frustrated, angry, and betrayed by government. And race is an essential part of this story." The older men and women with whom she spoke freely and talked to her comfortably about Mexicans, who make up about 4% of the population in Louisiana, were silent regarding the 26% of the population that is African American. Hochschild goes on to say that those she came to know don't see themselves as racist, they don't hate blacks, and they feel that's a characterization foisted upon them by those from the North. But the blacks they know, and I use know in quotation marks, enter their world through 2 doors, television and the newspaper. And she goes on to write, in one image, blacks were the mega-rich stars of music and film and sports. So what was the problem? In a second image, blacks were the disproportionate part of the criminal class and of its glorification of raunchy rap lyrics. And in a third image, blacks were living on welfare. And that deep story has created fertile ground for the I always mess up this word, iconography, rallying cries, and policies of the Trump campaign and administration. As with George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Lyndon Johnson, and historians and our nation's progress will ultimately determine Donald Trump's relationship with the principles articulated at the founding of our country. But in my opinion, the evidence thus far points to a president who seems either unacquainted with or deeply dismissive with those principles and quite comfortable with the exploitation of the friction in American life that services his electoral success. In my opinion, he's not wrestling with these issues as Washington and Lincoln and Johnson did. Rather, he's embracing and advancing them at every turn. Whether it's a dog whistle like Make America Great Again, the articulated return of the Southern strategy, or an express support for some of the, quote, very fine people among the neo-Nazis and KKK who carried tiki torches through this city, he has embraced that friction, and that is just the tip of the iceberg. What's so deeply disturbing is that President Trump is taking those positions in a different time. It is not 1790. It's not 1860. We're not in the 19th century or at the turn of the 20th, making the mistakes of Andrew Jackson or Woodrow Wilson. It's 2017. The Trump administration's rhetoric and policies clearly reflect the friction with the founding principles, but they are also inconsistent with 21st century progress that preceded them. So where do we go from here? The bottom line is that Benjamin Franklin was right. It's up to us. In a small r Republican government, power rests with the people, and we must consent to be governed. The president and the presidency reflect who we are, the citizens who vote and those who choose to stay home. Washington and Lincoln and Johnson and Trump are a mirror on our society, for better and for worse. And while leadership calls people to do important things, ultimately, that's the American citizenry and our sense of our civic virtue. The president upholds American ideals and principles if and when we demand it. To tackle our big policy questions, there are structural issues that we must address: access to the ballot without interference, the role of money in politics, the media cycle that often provides everyone, whether left or right, with talking points that they want rather than those that are needed to make informed decisions. We must also have an informed and honest and forthright and tough assessment of our history, not as our dusty past, but as a predecessor to the laws, the economy, and the culture we have today. But there's something else that I believe is critical if we and our president are to uphold the country's founding principles, an inclusive and shared American identity. And I will close with this short story. And this story I learned through the Miller Center Oral History Project when I was preparing to do the rollout of Senator Kennedy's oral history with you, Barbara. In the early 1950s, Ted Kennedy was assigned to duty at Camp Gordon. It was then called Camp Gordon, now called Fort Gordon, near Augusta, Georgia. And in his oral history interview, Senator Kennedy describes an ongoing conflict that he had with one of his fellow soldiers. And he said that this was someone who would never, ever, ever do KP. And for those of you who may have been in the military, I imagine, yeah, I heard someone laugh, you know the frustration with someone who will never do KP. This person was also an African-American soldier. So one day, Senator Kennedy, in his interview, said he had had enough. So he stormed out of the kitchen, and he went to find this soldier. And he found him in his barracks. The beds had been pushed back, and he was shooting dice. And Senator Kennedy said to him, "Well, you know we've got KP." And he said, "Well, you know I'm shooting dice." And they got into a fight, and the fight escalated into a fist fight. It was eventually broken up by other soldiers and a higher-ranking soldier who said, "You can have this fight at the appointed time on grounds, but for now, you're going to do KP." Kennedy says he goes back to the kitchen. The soldier never showed up, and neither of them showed up on grounds for the fight. And in the interview, the interviewer said to Senator Kennedy, "So do you think that this was about race and class?" And Senator Kennedy said, "No, absolutely not. Because when you are in the Army, you learn who you can count on and who you can't. And it has nothing to do with any of these externalities. It is just about the character of the individuals that you are working with." And after working for Kennedy for 8 years, I trusted him. But in the words of another president, I decided to verify. And I was fortunate in my source, because about 3 years after Senator Kennedy was stationed at Camp Gordon, my father had been stationed there. And so I took the transcript to my dad, and I said, "Read this and tell me what you think." And he did, and I said, "Kennedy, right or wrong?" He said, "Absolutely right. You figured out who you could work with and who you could count on. Race didn't matter." Shared experiences and goals help us to better understand what we have in common with one another and our common humanity. And they ultimately will allow us to make better decisions to achieve a country in keeping with our ideals and our principles. I love this country, and I say that as an American, as a woman, as an African American, as a Southerner, a Virginian, as a Richmonder. And I desperately want us to live our founding principles and ideals, and to have leadership that will breathe life into those ideals. A country where any child could imagine reaching out and touching the hair of any president and seeing themselves. Thank you.
Someone's got the spirit. Thank you, Melody, so much for that. Very thoughtful and compelling and elegant lecture for us today. Those of you who are routinely here at the Miller Center have heard me say this before, but I'll say it again, and that is that to have a position at the Miller Center on the faculty is a dream job for me, and I know others of my faculty colleagues think the same. And it's because it's not just a dream job, it's a dream job because it's a calling, it's a vocation, and for me personally, it's my avocation as well. But what I love so much about it, in addition to following the mission of the Miller Center to study American politics and the presidency and policymaking within the context of our constitutional system and structure, as Mr. Miller had hoped when he founded the Miller Center back at another difficult time, having gone through the 60s and 70s. What I enjoy most is the fact that Melody came into my office back in the winter, I guess it was, and we knew that she was going to do this lecture, and that's months and months ago, and she beautifully outlined this lecture. And I could picture it, I could see it in my mind's eye, and I knew that it was going to be superb. But then I got to see the finished product today, so it's almost as if Michelangelo comes in and says, I have this concept to do a beautiful sculpture. I'm going to call it David, and I would like to just sort of outline it for you, and then someday you go off and you see a finished artistic work. So it is just a great compliment that you have graced us with this today. I'm going to talk to Melody for a few minutes, and then we'll turn the floor open to you. If you are so inclined, when we call for questions and you'd like to go to the back of the room to the microphone, we'd be happy for you to do that. If you are not so inclined to go to the back of the room but you have a question, and I ask that they be in the form of a question rather than another lecture, just raise your hand and I will call on you and then I'll repeat the question. But for a few moments, let me chat with Melody. As you were speaking particularly about your opening theme of presidents as symbols, I am particularly fascinated by that concept. And I began to become fascinated by it in the mid-1990s, about the time that I was to go to the U.S. Supreme Court to do a year-long fellowship there. Not as a lawyer, because I am not one, nor do I play one on television, but I am a political scientist, and they have a judicial fellowship program now called Supreme Court Fellows, founded by Chief Justice Warren Burger, much like the White House Fellows, to bring social scientists and lawyers to the court for a year, to see it up close and personal. And there were some issues involving the court just prior to my going there. One that was that Thurgood Marshall had died, and within a year of his death, he had asked that his papers be released. And they were released by the Library of Congress as he had wished. But the court itself was upset about that, because typically there's a longer waiting time. And so they knew that things that had just happened at the court just that year before were going to come in to the open. That was one issue the court was having. Another was a political scientist and lawyer called Peter Irons had gone to the National Archives and listened to the audio tapes of oral arguments at the Supreme Court, which had begun back in the 1950s and were put into the archives for scholars and students and citizens to use, but for their private or scholarly use. And he somehow made copies of these and then published them, both as a book of transcripts of the greatest hits of the Supremes, as well as that time cassettes. And I was really pleased that one of my students, I was teaching at Sweetbriar then, sent a copy to me. So I got home one summer's day, and there was this giant package on my front porch. And as I say, this is an avocation, not just a vocation. So I ran in and started listening to the greatest hits. These are oral arguments going back to the 50s from the Supreme Court. But I began to wonder, isn't this interesting that the court itself is having an issue about what people think about it? And at the same time, I came across a book here in a bookstore in Charlottesville. Of course, the bookstore was private, no longer exists, but it was a book by a now late political scientist called Barbara Hinckley, called The Symbolic Presidency: How Presidents Portray Themselves. And she gave this definition of a political symbol that I jotted down as Melody was speaking, because I've used it so frequently now to apply it to the court and to the presidents and to first ladies and to the White House that I've virtually memorized it. It goes something like this. A political symbol is an object that has a range of meaning beyond itself. And that meaning may be expanded to include moral, psychological, or political meanings. And then this is the kicker to me. That extra meaning, the symbolic meaning, need not be independently true, but will tap into ideas that people want to believe in as true. And I find that fascinating, to think about how the Supreme Court presents itself, how presidents present themselves, how we think of our Constitution as a symbol. And so I wondered, Melody, if you could think in those terms, particularly as it gets to your next point about the differences between our ideals, our American ideals, and sometimes how those diverge from reality.
I think also that is such an interesting point. Recently, and I feel very fortunate to do this, I see one of my students was here from my class, but because of my class and in preparing for this lecture, it's allowed me, the history major, to do a lot of reading and listening to podcasts and delving into past presidents. And George Washington, and as I mentioned in the lecture, was a president or person that allowed others to conceive of and become comfortable with this idea of a presidency. And he was so aware, acutely aware, of the symbolic nature, of the fact that he was first and what that would mean to all other presidents that would follow behind him. And so there were just a litany of things that he did and didn't do, or questions that he had and situations that he would try to navigate, so that he could, because he was aware that he was setting a precedent for others. And at that time, it was a question of, did he look presidential or did he look more monarchical? I mean, did he look more king-like, or did this look like a president that was more true to the Republican form of government that we had formed? And I think even starting with that very first example of a president, as we look forward, we can see the fact that that symbol, in fact, does matter deeply. That it not only tells us something about who we are as a people, but it tells the rest of the world something about who we are as a democracy, as a constitutional republic. So those symbols have great meaning for us, and I think in particular in the context that I was discussing today, they can help reflect what's happening in the country and the direction that the country is taking. And while I don't think, well, in many cases presidents will lead, and I think they will take that from what people and what the public are giving them, the broader public will look to the symbol of the presidency to determine how we will react and respond to these significant issues that sit on the national stage for us. So that symbol, I think, is very, very potent.
And this brings me then to, some of you may be very much aware of the program that the Miller Center has now been engaged in for the last 2 years. In fact, it's just about exactly 2 years that we kicked off what we call the first year. And Melody's been very much involved in it, as many of my colleagues here, and Bill Antholis, our director, has been leading us in this endeavor. And it was to think about 2 years ago who would become president in 2017, and to think about the first year of that new presidency, and to do what the Miller Center does best, which is to take current issues and current policies and current personages on the political stage and place them in historical context. So my colleagues and I, with our great research team here, have, first of all, went back and looked at the first year of every American president. And some, of course, had 2 first years. Lyndon Johnson, for example, had 2 first years because he had a first year in finishing out the term of John F. Kennedy, the assassinated president under whom he served as vice president. Then he was elected in his own right, as you know, in 1964 by a landslide, and then he had another first year. So some presidents we looked at twice for that. In doing that now, we are thinking in terms of how does the first year of the Trump presidency fit into historical context. And we're also, I'm hearing a few chuckles, but it is a very serious endeavor, as you can imagine. And we are going to build upon that, our next endeavor, our next project, which at least for now has a working title of The Presidency at the Crossroads. And so back to your concept of presidents as symbols and symbolism that surrounds presidency, the presidency, and the American creed that surrounds it, I wondered if you would ponder this notion of the presidency at the crossroads now, because this is not meant to be by any means a partisan statement, because those who voted for Donald Trump obviously wanted a different turn. Mm-hmm. They came to the crossroads and they wanted a turn that was in a different direction from where the country had been going. So when you think of that metaphor, another symbol of the presidency at the crossroads, how do you view, from what you've studied in terms of the historical presidency, the whole point of this historical lecture series, but also the president you worked for, as well as the current president. Where do you see us at this crossroads? And if you could perhaps project, what will be the impact of this current president at this crossroads of an institution for future presidents and future presidencies?
Can I ask a question? When you are talking about the presidency at the crossroads, mm-hmm. say a little bit more for us about the crossroads in terms of how we are defining the president because of this, because of the Trump presidency, or?
Great question, and we're still working through mm-hmm. how we want to define this and describe it, so I'm glad this is why I asked the question, because I am taking your free time here to get some feedback from you. So I think one thing that we see is that the presidency has often come to crossroads, mm-hmm. some of which you described, in part based on what was happening, and I'll go to a different point and then circle back. Another of my favorite books is by Samuel Huntington about what he called the promise of disharmony in the American regime. And it very much relates to what you covered today, and that is that he talked a lot about something that I, like you, who love this country, believe very strongly in, and that's an American creed. Mm-hmm. And that our American creed is about liberty and equality, to be sure, and other aspects of the American regime that we hold tight to and that we respect, and that is symbolized, by the way, by our flag and the people who fight and die for an American, which he pointed to as an interesting aspect of our creed. And in part it's because we are a nation of immigrants, that in order to unify, and you talked about the theme of unity mm-hmm. in Washington and in Lincoln, that Huntington viewed this as we have to have an American creed that we share in order to unify us. And so if people begin stepping outside that, they could be viewed as un-American. That's led to all sorts of issues about liberty and equality. But what Huntington says is that when that creed, that ideal, begins to depart from reality, which is really the theme that runs through mm-hmm. your entire lecture, that then we often have uprisings. And so he would talk about what would be a peaceful uprising in the 1830s of Jacksonian democracy, that Jackson, as a man of the people, and who saw in his mind a regime that wasn't democratic enough. So through the peaceful means, we always prefer that, the peaceful mm-hmm. means of a change of government from a federalist-oriented society, or even a Jeffersonian view of the Democratic Party as he founded it, that the franchise expanded. The franchise expanded beyond white propertied males to include white males without property, which was a huge expansion of the franchise, and thus we call it Jacksonian democracy. Then we have, sadly, violent responses to when there are questions about this diversion between ideals and reality, and we see that in the 1850s leading to the Civil War, and we certainly see it in the 1960s. So how many of you are watching the Vietnam War PBS special by Ken Burns? My colleagues and I have been talking about, Guillen and I have been talking, for example, about, by the way, the Miller Center contributed a major part to that through Mark Silverstone, my historian colleague, and Ken Hughes, because all the parts that are tape recordings, so if you notice, particularly with Johnson, you'll have these fascinating segments where Johnson is talking to Everett Dirksen, or he's talking to Hubert Humphrey, or he's talking to Richard Nixon. And those are contributed by the Miller Center, by our presidential recordings team. They have gone through and found those for Ken Burns, and they have edited and annotated them. So we're very proud of that. But Guillen and I have been talking about, is there enough of what was happening domestically in this country during the Vietnam War? And Guillen is here today, so we'll ask him if he thinks as the show goes on, if indeed it has been doing that. I'm noticing more and more domestic politics woven in, but what I'm seeing, of course, is what was happening domestically in the United States at that time. A lot of violence in the streets over race, race riots in our major cities, to be sure. They showed, and Bill and Russell and I just came back from talking to the Obama Foundation about their oral history, and we stayed at the Chicago Hilton. And so I walked into the Chicago Hilton, and it's such a historic hotel. It was founded in 1927, here's some trivia to impress your friends with, by the father of John Paul Stevens, the future Supreme Court Justice. It was called the Stevens Hotel until it was taken over by the Hiltons in the 1950s. But it's been so...
I want to play Jeopardy with you.
On
my team.
I'll take meaningless Supreme Court trivia for 10, Alex. But thank you. I would love to serve on a team with you. So I go there, and they have pictures of the history of all the famous people who've come to the Hilton. By the way, since it opened in 1927, every American president has visited the Chicago, now called the Chicago Hilton. But they also had a picture of their history, which was all of the combat troops stationed out in front of the Hilton, which was the Democratic headquarters during the 1968 Democratic Convention. So think of the violence that went on in the streets of Chicago at that time. So another example of Huntington's, when people view the creed, the American creed, as being in their minds not squared with reality, sometimes there is an uprising in this country that takes us on to the next level. So I guess one question about this crossroads is, have we been seeing a change in the presidency as an institution, not that started with Donald Trump, but some may even argue in most recent times? Obviously, we've seen changes in the presidency throughout, which you have guided us through. But we saw with President Obama, for example, you mentioned executive orders. Because there was so little, I would say, coordination with the Congress once it switched after the Tea Party uprising, which, by the way, was an uprising, right? The Tea Party, after the Affordable Care Act, said, this is not how we view the American creed, in essence. This is not how we view American government. Give us back our government. Don't tread on me. Took the flag from the Revolutionary days with the snake. Don't tread on me, that you see on license plates all over Virginia these days. So for Obama, then, after Republicans took over the Congress, it was very difficult to get things through, including, you mentioned DACA, including comprehensive immigration reform. So what did the president do but turn to executive orders, which we have seen carried on through the Trump administration now. So again, it doesn't have to be that this crossroads is a statement about Donald Trump, but is our system fundamentally changing, our constitutional system fundamentally changing to the point where it's brought the Constitution, our three branches of government, and since we particularly studied the presidency, to, let's call it, an intersection, that there are decisions to be made now. Do we carry forward? So if you use the metaphor, do we go straight through the intersection, stop? Is it a stoplight? Slow down. Is it a four-way stop in our metaphor where you look to see what else is happening around the crossroads and you take care about that? Do you race through the stoplight that's red? Is there a cautionary light that goes on? Or do you make a U-turn and go back, or do you turn left or right? There you go.
Well, I believe, one, there's always been this push-pull, a questioning about the role of the presidency from the beginning. And with the framers, an understanding that that push-pull was going to happen, and that would set in motion regulation of and a balancing of our tripartite form of government. And at points in time, there were presidents that were quieter presidents, and Congress was much more bold. And then you will see the shift. You know, there were presidents who wanted to reconstitute the courts because they weren't getting out of them, Franklin Roosevelt, what they wanted to get out of them. So there's always been this constant pulling and pushing. And certainly one of the things, and we discussed this in my class, was a point, at Wilson, who was a scholar, who also felt that the presidency needed to be much bolder. And in fact, that would help Congress. It would help show Congress the way if you had a bolder president that was more in touch with people and with public opinion and with public sentiment, which was something that was very different or perceived as being quite different than the years before. So I think that's always been underway. And then an overlay, or maybe not an overlay, sitting underneath that have been these moments in time, and I alluded to this, or more than an allusion, stated this, where the public has responded and reacted based on its needs because of its sense of a need for expansion or a re-articulation of rights in the way that they see befitting the country, and they have pushed our institutions to respond in kind. What I think is interesting right now is that, as a general matter, it feels as though that pushing and pulling has happened generally within a set of guardrails. And right now, and these are my beliefs and my background, it shouldn't surprise anyone, that I feel as though the guardrails are down, and that we are operating in some ways in uncharted territory. And our institutions are trying to respond to that. I mean, the courts are certainly trying to respond to that. It's interesting watching after the reaction to President Obama's use of executive orders, and I understand the arguments on both sides of that, the current use of executive orders, and the inability to move and to work with Congress, even holding a majority in Congress. So institutions are acting in the way that I think they were generally designed, but at the same time, the rhetoric, the language, and their relationship, as I said, to core foundational principles, I think reflects a dropping of the guardrails that I find to be disheartening, uncomfortable, and deeply troubling.
While you are now beginning to either go to the back of the room to check in at the microphone there or finalizing in your minds your questions, I have one more, and this is a little more lighthearted for Melody. I read, and I want to know if this is the truth. Were you the first woman to be invited by President Obama to play golf with him?
I think as president, yes. I mean, that certainly... If the news cameras were any measure, and for anyone who plays golf, the last thing you want are news cameras around, I was, and it was funny to me because I'd been talking to kind of his body person, and he said, "Hey, POTUS is wondering if you want to play golf." I'm like, "Sure," and it was a gorgeous day, and we were going to meet them at the golf course. But there was a big race in D.C. that shut down lots of roads, so we thought we will never get there on time. We better just get to the White House and we can hop in the motorcade. And so we pull up, and all of a sudden, it's like, as my husband said, if I saw you one more time on CNN with that golf bag, I was just going to jump out of a window. So, yes.
How'd you do? I must ask, as an oral historian,
yeah, right.
how'd you do?
You get to the first tee. Are there golfers in the room?
Anybody here play golf?
Okay.
Yeah.
So, the first tee is always a moment unless you're a scratch golfer. The president and his good friend Eric had teed off, and Marvin had teed off, and I was going to use every advantage. So yes, I went to the ladies' tees, and so I'm sorry. The forward tees, thank you. The forward tees. And so we pull up, and I get out, and I remember thinking, and I am a person of faith, I thought, please God, just don't let me whiff the ball. Just don't let me whiff the ball. And so there's, the president sitting there, and we had teamed up. I was on his team, too, so,
Not too much pressure.
No, so, everybody's sitting there, they're watching, including the cameras. And prayer works. And I teed off and down the middle and straight out.
Straight down the middle.
Yeah, and the president goes, nice swing. And I thought, and at that point, anything could happen.
Matter,
it was
didn't
good.
Matter.
But we did, in fact, win.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you.
All right, Fred Scott.
Can I take a point of personal privilege? I think they use that term. I'm Karen Turner's husband, otherwise I'm unimportant. But she introduced me to Margaret Spethman, and who had dinner with us a couple of weeks ago at our home, along with our academics. And I said, you want to meet a Virginia lady? You bring your German friends back over. There are 12 of her friends here today from Germany, and this is what a Virginia lady looks like.
Thank you.
Well, I had a chance to meet Margaret. I was introduced to her, and we welcome our friends from Germany. My mother was a Grunwald, and so I am almost 100% of German heritage, and we're glad to have you here today. And if you have questions, please come forward.
Absolutely.
Other questions? Yes?
Well, since with that forward pass.
Yes, yes.
First of all, wonderful talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Obviously, being German, I would like to get your opinion on as American presidents as international symbols. Primarily, your talk was understandably on domestic issues and things that Americans are concerned about, but as the international community looks upon America as the leader of the free world, how do you think about that at this particular moment in time?
Sure. I have spent a lot of time, particularly in recent years, traveling abroad, including to Germany, had some wonderful trips to Germany. And I am always struck when I am abroad by the reaction, which I have found generally to be quite positive, to Americans and the knowledge of American politics. It is striking. I think Americans, as a general matter, can't have that level and sophisticated a conversation about the politics of other countries in the way that I find when I'm abroad. And as a general matter, the respect for the American president as a symbol of the country, and America, even though there are times where people are really angry or frustrated with America or don't understand what American policy is or why it's done, it has been my experience there's a general level of respect and appreciation for America, whether I'm in Australia or China or South Africa or Germany or all over Europe. My husband and I, at the time of the 2016 election, were in South Africa. And we were in Johannesburg staying with a good friend who at that time was the U.S. ambassador to South Africa. And he was having an election party. So we spent the night with him. We were there with my husband's cousin and her friends, all of whom were Canadian or Dutch. And being there that particular day and the response by South Africans after the election was so striking to me. Again, the sophistication with which they engaged us about the conversation, but also the questioning about what was happening in America. And since then, the conversations I've had with people abroad are quite similar. And again, people know my background, so I guess people who aren't supporters of my political lineage would maybe not engage with me or have a different conversation. But consistently what I have found is that there's a level of disappointment. I know when we were in Australia during the primary season, people kept saying to us, we just don't understand what's happening. And we just don't understand what's happening. And people quite honestly saying, we look to America for leadership, and this is deeply disturbing to us. And that has been the sequence of conversations that I've had around the world.
I'm the American, the German. And I watch what's happening from a German perspective in some ways. But this week we've been spending a lot of time on Jefferson. And yesterday at the university there was this sentence that's still ringing in my ears that Jefferson said, and Jefferson was very convinced that a democracy to survive needs an educated population. Then there's some other bastardization of that is that a democracy gets the government it deserves. I think a lot about the checks and balances. Are there any checks on a president?
I'm going to repeat.
And are we getting, because of the way our society has evolved, are we getting the president we deserve to teach us, or,
I'm going to summarize that in part because we are putting this out over Facebook Live, as I understand. So the question is about, first of all, Mr. Jefferson's view that in order for democracy to survive, an educated citizenry is necessary. What is the status of the principle of checks and balances in our constitutional system, and has the United States arrived at the president it deserves?
Well, one, you mentioned a couple of phrases that I often reflect on and often think about. I'm not just saying that because we are sitting here on Facebook Live, apparently. I am struck by the fact when you tour Monticello, and I am very proud to be on the board of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, which owns and operates Monticello, that Jefferson, and I'm going to get this a little bit wrong, I think could read in 7 languages. And the founders, as I mentioned, I alluded to in my speech, were generally young and extremely well-read and educated, and believed that to engage, if we were going to have representative government, as part of encompassed in civic virtue was the fact that you were going to be educated so that you could engage to make those decisions, to make informed decisions. What has been disturbing to me is a leitmotif, and this has been going on for a very long time, where there's been a level of comfort almost with, I don't travel abroad if I'm able to. We don't look at examples from those from abroad. And we aren't embracing the idea of the best possible education for every child, every young adult in the country, because that allows for an engaged and informed citizenry. That is the active form of citizenship that a constitutional republic has to have. And I wish more people would reflect on the fact that the founders were reading these philosophers, that they were traveling abroad, that they were learning other languages, and that was considered to be part of education, and hence why Thomas Jefferson believed in that ideal enough to construct the University of Virginia, designed around a library, very different than other places where universities were designed around a chapel. To your question about checks and balances, even as I struggle in this moment, I do see those checks and balances in effect, perhaps not as robustly as I would like to see them, but I do see them in effect. I certainly know that I felt them when I was sitting in the White House and working out of the West Wing as well, and that is necessary and it is important. But again, for all of that to operate in its most efficient and effective, it requires an informed, educated citizenry that's making decisions and taking on as a real responsibility the right and the privilege of voting to send people to act on our behalf and make those decisions and to press them to make those decisions for us. And that goes to the final part of your question. And I have often said that we get the government that we deserve. And I say that wincing at this point because that also reflects a couple of different things. I mean, this does reflect the Electoral College and the decision of the Electoral College. It also reflects a lot of people who stayed home and people who feel disengaged from government, who feel that it has no applicability to their lives, that it's something far, far away, and we have to do something about that. You know, I am starting in a couple of weeks working with middle school students on civic engagement, and it's one of my little things that I can do to help them understand that you are not acted upon, you are an actor, you have agency, you have a responsibility in this. So in that way, whether you vote or you stay home, we are constructing this government. And as I said in my remarks, and even when I started working on this lecture, I was thinking about the president holding up the idea of America in one way, and I came to the conclusion as I worked through it and thought about it over months that that is us, and we have to act accordingly.
Well, because this is my avocation, I could talk to Melody for hours, but we are coming to our appointed moment when we must stop. I'm sure that she would stay for a few minutes if you'd like to come forward with some questions, but in the meantime, please thank her warmly for being here today.